Welcome, everybody. I know that we've had a lot of different topics and a lot of different things that we've been talking about having to do with, generative AI and its role really throughout the software process and different kinds of software development life cycles and so forth. Um, I've had an opportunity now over the last year really to, you know, meet and work with a whole lot of different people who are doing some really interesting things in many different areas using generative AI. But, you know, there are a lot of people for whom a lot of what we're going to present here will be very new or will be, oh, I didn't know it could do that. And so, the big thing really to convey is, you're not behind the curve. Jump in, start doing some things, start picking up on what you see here. But Lara, I forgot to mention in all of this is that not only do we have, AI for project management, AI for business analysis, but very soon, and I got to get back to working on this immediately after this particular webinar. We're going to have an AI for software testing class, possibly as early as the next month or so. So stay tuned for that because I know that we've gotten a lot of interest in that when we've been doing the AI for BA, business analysis, the AI for project management. People say, well, what about testing? Right? So just a little background on myself. I've been kind of doing this stuff since about forever. I started off as a developer in the world of real-time and embedded systems working for Siemens Corporation, but then came out here to California to work with some folks named Sally Schler and Steve Meller. They were some of the early object-oriented analysis and design folks, worked at ThoughtWorks with Martin Fowler and was kind of on one of, I guess, what today we would call one of the early Agile projects. But back then, we just called it being weird. Then started my own firm and started reselling some of our, analysis and design training courses. That's what kind of got me connected in with SoftEd. And about a year and a half ago, when all of this talk about generative AI and ChatGPT started hitting the news, there was one day I was kind of jet lagged in a hotel about 3 o'clock in the morning. I think, okay, I'm going to try this stuff. I'm going to try this generative AI. I put a few prompts in and I went, well, this changes everything. And what did I do? I basically had to do some basic stuff that we would have to do as a business analyst or as a software tester. Like, give me the test cases for this problem. And I was amazed. So what I'm going to share with you right now are some of those things that were kind of amazing in all of this, and some of the things that we are able to do, and kind of just a little picture of where the future might be, for this industry. So we're going to start off kind of beginning by sort of setting up a goal. I've kind of talked through a lot of that already. Our goal is to learn about how AI can be used for software testing. Then we're going to jump into that very first kind of thing that many people do when they learn how to use generative AI for testing, and that is to get in and say, make me some test cases. Not only are we going to try one agent, we're going to try a whole bunch of different agents. And in the last few months, some of the agents have actually developed different, flavors of the agent. There's ChatGPT 3.5 and there's ChatGPT 4.0. There are a couple different variations of Claude out there today. Well, guess what? Each one of those has different models behind it, has different properties, and so does a different job of generating test cases. So, of course, once we can do that, once we can get those test cases, we're going to need to evaluate them. So we're going to show you how AI can be used to evaluate, not just to evaluate the test cases that come from AI agents, which you might think, well, that's kind of interesting. Why would I have an AI agent evaluate what comes out of AI? Well, guess what? It works. I'll show you. But we can use it to evaluate test cases, test plans that we might have had in place long before there was any thought of AI. Right? I'll show you some of that as well. Then, of course, we have to sort of step back from the problem of, well, that's nice, we can generate test cases, but we also need to think about the overall planning of a testing activity. So we'll look at a couple of common models that people use for planning testing activities on software projects, how AI can be used to help in that planning process. Then, of course, we'll come back to the problem of creating tests and see that once we get past sort of little toy problems, AI kind of forces us to develop and maintain some sort of an organizational strategy, some sort of an architecture. Some people would even use the term a meta model of how does our problem come together. We'll see why that's important, and also get an idea of how we can use that for managing AI on larger projects. Finally, of course, when people think about testing, especially testing under agile projects, immediately what word comes to mind after test? Automation. Okay, so we've heard that AI can generate code. How can it do with creating test cases? Well, we saw that. How can it go with, well, could it generate automated tests? After all, they're a kind of code. So how would that work? What's involved in doing that? And how does involving generative AI make the problem of test automation that much better, easier, simpler, faster, cheaper, and so forth? Okay, so, way back in the day when I got started in the business, you probably recognize this, testing was kind of a backwater. It was kind of where, well, it wasn't always seen as being the best place to be in the software business. Okay. Now, of course, in recent years, with the emergence of things like agile methods and test-driven development and behavior-driven development and acceptance test-driven development, all the DDs, as I call them, testing has kind of become a hot area. I mean, DevOps, okay, continuous integration and automated testing are all parts of that. So testing has gotten new respect. Now, another thing that's been said about testing, one of the Box said, and I don't know if he was the first one to say this, but he was the first one I heard to say this, is testing is experimentation. We're going to conduct experiments on our software. Well, in that sort of theme of experimentation, let's see if we can experiment with generative AI to create test cases. So we're going to start with the problem of generating tests. And to do that, we're going to start with a classic problem going all the way back to the late 1970s from Glenn Meyer's Art of Software Testing book. In the first chapter of that book, he says, here's a little self-test we're going to give you. We want you to write test cases for the following. And he describes the problem and says, basically, write enough test cases to completely cover this program that tells you whether or not the three sides that you enter, like 3, 3, 3, would be an equilateral triangle. All three sides are equal. Or 3, 3, 4, okay, that's an isosceles triangle because two sides are the same length, the other is different. And of course, the third would be, what if you say 3, 4, 5? That's a scalene triangle. Okay. So, you know where I'm going with this. I'm going to say, throw this at our agent. So how would I prompt an agent to do that? Well, very simple. I'm just going to take the description of the problem, and I'm going to say, give me a set of test cases with the actual test data from this program. Now, in a way, some people would say, well, I know this problem, and you actually are already cheating a little bit because you included the phrase actual test data. Well, okay. I want to compare apples to apples, and you'll see what I mean in just a moment. All right, so now, unlike in some of our presentations where nope, that wasn't the right thing to do. Let's go back to sharing. I need to get out of the PowerPoint for a second. Okay, so let's give it ChatGPT 3.5. This is the free version of ChatGPT that you would get if you just go sign up for an account on OpenAI. This is what you get. So we get the equilateral triangle, the isosceles, the scalene. Okay, we've got an invalid triangle of one form or another, negative length 0. All right, you see we've got, a series of different test cases here. But this is possibly good. I'm not going to reveal, how good for a moment, because we're going to go through and we're going to throw this at other models. So here's GPT-4. All right, now, if GPT-3.5 came up with 10, well, here we go. Uh-oh. GPT-4 is supposed to be better, but it only came up with 4 test cases. I think we've got to go to another agent. So let's go over to Claude. Let's see what Claude came up with. Okay, Claude, 1, 2, 3, 4, and let's see, 9. We have 8 test cases here. All right. Now, another one of our agents is Perplexity. What did Perplexity do? Okay, Perplexity only came up with 5 test cases. Now, of course, there are multiple versions of Claude and there are multiple versions of Perplexity out there. I'm going to kind of save us all of the details of that. We'll do one more, which is Google Gemini. And Google Gemini came up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so now I've got a whole lot of different test cases from a whole lot of different sources. Now, this is actually not really all that different from if you had given this problem to members of a small development team or test team and said, okay, go out and come up with some test cases. What would you want to do? You'd now want to take the results and you'd want to merge them together and to evaluate, the results of what was produced. Now, you might say, well, that's going to be kind of a, nasty activity. No, it's not, because we're going to give this we're going to make this into an AI problem. So I've taken all of the tables. In fact, one of the things I did to make it easier to manage all of this was I actually had the agents produce all of the test cases in the form of a table. Here you see, for example, that Gemini did it. For the others, I kind of had to ask it to produce a table. So I would say put the test cases into a table in columns with a title, a column for the inputs, and a column for the type of triangle. Okay, and that way, essentially, I'm able to look at all of these from all of the different agents and kind of come up with a sense of what the differences are. Oh, here I have Claude Opus. There are many different versions of Claude. One of the versions of Claude I gave it to was its so-called smart model, Opus. And Opus actually came up with a whole lot of test cases. All right. So, again, you can try a number of different agents. Ultimately, the goal is to say, I'm going to take that document, I'm going to throw that back at Claude, all right, because Claude's kind of my favorite because it can handle documents that are uploaded. Like I put all of the test cases into that Word document, said, give me a set of test cases with the data from this program, compare the different tables, and produce one comprehensive table of test cases. Okay, and so the result of this is now this complete table. All right. And of course, this table has, you would think I would have counted it before, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 test cases. Of course, if I wanted to get fancier with it, I would probably also ask it to produce another column on the table that would say which of the agents produced which of the test cases. And of course, I could use that as a way of judging and evaluating at least how the different agents handled this one particular problem. Okay. So now that's all well and good, but in Glenn Meyer's book, when you turn the page, he presents a set of evaluation criteria for the triangle problem. So he says, and this is taken directly from the book, do you have one of these? Do you have one of these? Do you have one of these? Did you specify the output from the program in addition to the input values? Did you use real input values? Okay. Again, we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to take the evaluation criteria. I'm going to say, compare this combined list to these comprehensive evaluation criteria. All right. Now, of course, we're going to see how well did it do, right? Well, we got across most of the problems, we seem to get most of them. Sometimes we weren't as good as what he wanted, but we kind of got there. But of course, there were some test cases that were missing. Okay. All well and good. Of course, you might look at this. So we tried a number of different agents. We've compared them. We've evaluated them. We compared against this list. But now, suppose someone says, well, that was a very abstract definition of test cases. Suppose what we'd like to do is we say we have an application that's really a web application. I know, for example, that if I'm doing a user interface application, I need to check not just for is the input missing or not, or is it a decimal or not. I have to check for what if it's alphanumerics, or what if somebody puts in other kinds of values. Okay, fair enough. So here's what we'll do. I'll prompt it and I'll say, this will be built as a web application with 3 input boxes and a compute button. Does this implementation architecture, in other words, choosing to do it as a web application, does this imply other test cases? Well, yeah. All right, we've got the empty inputs, partially filled in, non-numeric, leading and trailing white space. Like, what if you put a couple blank characters in front of your 3? Or what if you, try to do this with a tiny web browser or a big web browser, or checking accessibility, or, okay, is there a reset button on there? Well, yes, there is a reset button. Now, one of the interesting things that you'll notice about this, especially if you take a look at the problem of the reset button, is that nothing that was given to the agent specifically said to it, oh, there's going to be a clear button on the form, right? It kind of said, well, based on what I kind of know about the way that these kinds of things work, I think there would be. So let's test for this. So not only are the test cases going to give us a foundation, not only do the AI agents give us a foundation for what to test, but they also can kind of suggest, well, kind of looking at metaphors of other similar kinds of applications, I would expect that you'd have one of these. So while it may not have been as complete, now all the agents may not have been as complete as the Meyer's book would like us to have had, one of the things that the agents can do is they can use their overall knowledge of how things are supposed to work, what I sometimes call metaphor, to be able to come up with other things we should be looking for, other things we should be testing, or maybe even other things that might have to be put into the application. Now, of course, the flip side of this particular problem is the problem of hallucinations. Sometimes it might make up requirements. Sometimes when we ask the agents to produce test cases, it will start producing test cases for things that are not really our responsibility, or they're not really something that we want as a feature on the problem. Like, it could be the reset button. Maybe someone said, we don't want a reset button. Okay, it suggested it. Maybe we want to have it. Maybe we don't want to have it, right? The agent isn't going to be the be all and end all in terms of being able to give us the complete set of everything that we want to test. But it's going to be pretty smart. It's going to get us very much along the way that we want to be. Okay, so far, we had it generate tests, we had it evaluate tests from AI agents, we had it compare the tests against a known evaluation criteria. Now, what if I gave it a test plan that I already had? So another sample problem that I've used for years in basic training on software testing is a login problem. I'll say, how many different test cases can you come up with for this login problem? And, when kind of exploring all of this, I went through and I said, I found this test plan that I use at the beginning of a test automation class to kind of help participants see why we want to automate and what's needed in order to take kind of a manual protocol and to automate it. So I said, what if I give this login test plan to my AI agent? How would it handle that? Well, like most of the time with the AI agents, it comes back and it starts, well, this looks pretty good. But, okay. So one of the things that it does is right away it picks up on some of the errors. See, part of the purpose of the exercise, part of the purpose of the manual protocol is to get folks looking at it to see, do you notice that some of the steps, some of the instructions are incorrect or are not well stated? So do our agents find these kinds of things? Well, right away in the bad user error, it found verify you're logged in. No, you're not supposed to be logged in if the user's bad. See, somebody just did a copy paste when they built up the original document. Well, guess what? Humans might be able to overlook the problem. Computers, they're going to say, nope, you got a problem. Testing locked out. Okay, that's good. So forth and so forth. Okay, so, all right, it thinks it's pretty good. Well, every time an agent says, I think it's pretty good, I'm going to push it a little harder. I'm going to say, is there other functionality that you can think of? Now, once again, here we see our metaphor, or what some people would call hallucinations or pre-existing knowledge at work. It looks at the page, it looks at the test cases. Actually, it didn't look at the page, it just looked at the test cases. It said, should you have a remember me function on this particular login box? Well, now our login box doesn't have a remember me on it. There was nothing in the protocol, nothing in the test cases, the manual test cases that said that. It just sort of said, well, lots of people have these, so maybe you ought to have one of these. I think we should check the whole process, not just the login page. Oh, I think that we should check for case sensitivity, maximum login. Does this lock the user out? And so on and so on and so forth. So this example really illustrates the fact that even if you think you've got a pretty good test plan already in place, your agent is able to look at the plan and say, well, compared with other things of this same pattern, maybe there's stuff that you're missing. maybe you want to do something differently. Now, it's not saying you have to have that, right? It's giving you hints. You can slap it down and say, no, I'm not going to have that, and that's out of scope. Or you might look at some of the test cases and say, I think that the execution of some of these might be beyond, or the design of some of these might be beyond the capabilities of this group, but maybe we have a security team that does need to check for things like cross-site scripting, SQL injection, and so forth. So all in all, the agents are able to not only produce the test cases, they're able to evaluate the tests that you have. And both of these things right away can be extremely powerful. Okay, but so far we've only looked really at the problem of individual test cases. Now what we'd like to do is to look at the overall planning process. So I'm going to show you kind of two pictures that people see a lot of in testing courses and testing books. One of these is the Gregory and Crispin testing quadrants, which of course goes back even further before their book, but it's often cited to them, listing out different kinds of test cases. So, all right, I have an application overview. I'm going to give it the overview of a very simple employee expense reporting application. Again, the reason I'm using these examples is because these were examples, like this overview, was something that we had created long before there was ever any glimpse of AI, generative AI, for doing any of this. So I wanted to take this handwritten, manually written project overview. I wanted to throw it at it and say, give me an overall testing strategy for this kind of an application. Again, oops. So give it the overview. And of course, notice here, I didn't actually say what the quadrants were. Okay, I just said the Gregory and Crispin testing quadrants. In other words, hey, Claude, you happen to know what this is all about? And so here we go. Again, it's going to go look at all of these, and it's going to give us an overview of, well, how would you do the unit testing, component testing, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, to me, these are not really complete answers. I would probably, for example, when it says test interactions between related units or components, I would probably now take that and drill down further on it and say, what units, what components, how would I determine that? What questions do I need to ask, and of whom, to figure this out? Who will be doing this kind of work? All right. So again, I wouldn't just take the words that come here and say, oh, this is great, I'm going to put this into a test plan. I really would want to be able to continue to dig in further, with this. But again, this provides me the examples that I need of what all of these different areas happen to be. Now, by the way, one of the things that you will notice from time to time is that the agents don't always have their content formatted beautifully. Like if you're looking at the 5 versus the 6 versus the 7 and the bullets, they're not lined up. You know what? I wouldn't worry about that. I can reformat stuff by hand when I copy it out. The important thing is this is giving me ideas as to what each one of these areas means. I mean, again, one of the things that we often run into when we're presenting this either as instructors, as consultants, or as mentors within our own organization is we look at these particular pictures and we go, okay, so how do I make these relevant to my own team? How do I make this relevant to my own project? And so one of the things that an AI agent is very, very able to do is to answer the questions to make these relevant. Okay, so another format that we also find useful is something called a test strategy canvas. Again, different sets of questions, different things that need to be filled in. This is one of those elements that we say, build one of these at the start and then continue to refine it as you know more, as your project goes along and so forth. Again, can AI do it? Well, of course. I just give it the canvas and I'd say, go fill out the sections of the test strategy canvas. Now, of course, when doing this, it doesn't necessarily, create it in the form of a table. I'm happy to just get the answers to the questions and then we can discuss those. Now, of course, getting things into the appropriate format is one of the things that AI agents are capable of doing. Didn't want to focus on that though at this juncture. But, here we have, how will the test cases be designed? Right? Again, probably more questions for us to answer than just straight answers, which early on in a project is not a bad thing to have. And when I say early on, it could be early in the life cycle of the project, but it could also be early in your individual participation on a project, or early in the adoption of the use of AI. So again, here we have the various components of this particular strategy canvas. Now, one of the questions that struck me as I was kind of working this out, just ad hoc, it doesn't really belong to either one of these models, was, where should I be focusing my effort? So once I get a dialogue going with an agent, one of the things that I'll do is I'll say, okay, so where's some areas that I need to test heavily to check for bugs? Now, you might, if you're a real testing expert, you might say, well, what do you mean by test heavily? Okay. In other words, where should I be focusing my effort? If I have only limited effort and limited time, where should I be focusing on an application of this sort? Now, hopefully this is not just going to give me a straight answer. It's going to give me an answer which, as I mentioned, has its set of questions. Well, all right, boundary conditions. So are there data values that reside at boundaries? What are the end-to-end workflows, integration points? Okay, again, the security, access control. What do we have going on in those areas? And again, these are probably more giving us areas that we need to answer about than simply saying, oh, do this, right? It's giving us areas to think. All right, so we have this. Of course, as I said, not only do we need to have test cases and an overall strategy, but we also need to think about how is our system organized so that when we go in to start building test cases and we start using AI to build up our testing, maybe even use it for automation, that we're able to approach the problem in a reasonable way. As a colleague of mine sometimes says, generative AI is a great accelerator, but we have to be careful not to accelerate to chaos. All right, so there are many different pictures and models, again, that we can use to talk about software testing. One of these is the V model. Now, the V model is not necessarily a kind of, I'm not using it as its descendant of the waterfall picture. I'm using it for a very simple concept. While we might analyze and design top down, we build and test bottom up. Bottom up. Got to get things in the right order. Okay. Build, integrate, and test bottom up. And what we mean by that is essentially that our testing strategy will begin with very simple unitary kinds of tests. Now, notice I said unitary, not unit, because a lot of times when people hear the word unit test, they go, oh, I know what a unit test is. That's when my C# developers write other C# code that calls that C# code, and it all runs in their development. Well, that's one kind of unitary test. But say testing an individual UI page and then integrating it into an overall flow, and then integrating that flow into, a larger activity or process makes more sense. Okay, so as I've been talking about UI and unit and so forth, some of you might go, Mike Cohn's test automation pyramid. Again, reason for bringing this up is to illustrate the idea that the simple, small tests of each of the individual bits and pieces, whether they're code functions, classes, individual UI pages, individual, web service calls, we start with those as our foundation. And then we use those to build up to get to the bigger, long-running end-to-end tests. Now, when you do that, I like to have this sort of skeleton, if you will, for how to think about a system. Systems divide into processes, processes into activities, activities into tasks. What's an example of that? Well, we go back to our expense reporting problem. That's our system. A process, activities, all the way down to an individual task, like a login page. And so I'm able to take something like a login page, give it to our agent, and say, create some test cases for this. This functions exactly the same as what we saw earlier. Okay, it's the same idea. I can give it the page in terms of a description, but interestingly enough, as we'll see in a little bit, I could also take the HTML of the page, feed it into an agent, and say, what are the inputs that you see on here? What are the, different test cases that you can envision from this particular page? Now, of course, once we have the page, we can then say, use these test cases to create tests for the entire login sequence. And of course, the result of this would be a much more complete and sophisticated set of tests. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to, again, go through what the agents generate, but it's similar to what happened with the triangle problem. But more importantly, we start with the small test cases, and then notice how I say, use these to create tests for the entire login sequence. Again, one of the things that we'll see right away is that when we're doing this, we're going to use AI to do our test case generation. We will need to have some mechanisms in place for helping us to organize not only the different test cases, but also the layers and the relationships between those layers. Of course, all along, you went, but your test cases don't look like my test cases. My test cases are written in given, when, then, you say. Okay, so just simply take the test cases and say, can you write them in Gherkin format? Again, changing from one format to another, that's a pretty simple, straightforward problem. That's not something that's hard for an AI agent to do. This is something they know how to do. And of course, what's interesting about this is that when I have people have an agent write the test cases for them in Gherkin, sometimes they discover that the way that the agent produces the Gherkin is not the same way that they've been doing it. And that brings up a great opportunity for a discussion about, well, let's see. The agents might have been trained on lots and lots and lots of Gherkin examples. And maybe we can say that what it's come up with is sort of the wisdom of the crowd. Maybe it's kind of the standard or default way of doing it. Maybe it's not. Okay. And of course, it's not saying, okay, well, the way the agent does it is always right and the way you're doing it is always wrong. It simply brings up a point for a discussion. And it's interesting because, again, we can actually even tell the agent, in our world, we put the setup into the given clause and only the button press is part of the when clause. How would you rewrite the gherkin in those cases? That's not the way I would do it, by the way, but you could certainly ask the agent to rewrite things in a different format, see what that looks like, and go, okay, now I can do a comparison of this a lot faster than if I were trying to write them by hand. Okay, the final area we're going to take a look at where AI can be helpful is in the area of test automation. Now, as far as automation is concerned, everybody wants it. Everybody says it's essential. And it kind of reminds me, and why do we want it? Because ultimately, if we want to run our tests lots of times, running those by hand is just too slow. But the problem we always run into kind of reminds me of the old Aesop's fable. The mice are all sitting around and going, if the cat had a bell on, we'd know when the cat was coming. The wise old mouse says, but who will put the bell on the cat? Now, of course, you might wonder, where'd this drawing come from? Hey, of course, it came from DALL-E, all right? Part of OpenAI. I actually just simply said to DALL-E, write an illustration, illustrate the story of Aesop's fable of, who will bell the cat? There it is. Okay, so who's going to create the automated tests? Now, that's always been a big issue in a lot of organizations. Now, some people will say, oh, well, we're going to do it by a record playback tool like Selenium IDE. Other people will say, well, no, we need to have developers do this. Or others will say, well, we're using a more sophisticated automation framework, and it allows for some things to be recorded and some things to be coded. And, well, the salespeople tell me it all magically works together. Well, that can be. But here's where it gets really interesting. When you record tests with Selenium IDE, Selenium IDE is a web browser plugin that allows you to record browser actions, including verifications of results of what you see on the screen, and it plays them back. Now, it is kind of simplistic in a way. It's not as great as if you were writing all your tests directly in Selenium and code, and it's not for things like, smartphone apps or things like that, although there's probably variations of that out there. And it has its pluses. It gets you to test cases quickly. It has its minuses. It doesn't scale up all that well. Well, something interesting I tried. Selenium IDE code is basically just JSON, JavaScript object notation. So the other day, I said, here's the login page. Here's the HTML of the login page. Can you create a series of runnable test cases in Selenium IDE and Selenium IDE's JSON format? It ran them. It did it. Right? Now, of course, to be able to do that, I had to provide a bunch of additional information. Okay, so for example, it needed to know the URL. It needed to know the IDs or the locator expressions for all of the individual UI elements, not only the input things, but also the outputs that needed to be checked. In a way, a lot of the rules about how to build good applications that are easy to test with test automation, they still apply. But what I've also found was really interesting, again, in playing around with Selenium IDE or Selenium in general, web applications and our AI agents, was that, pardon me, I could give it a page. In other words, the HTML of a page. I could say, find me the locator expressions for these particular elements. And some of the agents were able to do a better job than even Selenium IDE's built-in rules for figuring out good locator expressions. So if you're in the process of having to build a series of automated test cases, it's pretty darn good AI agents are pretty darn good at being able to help you through some of this. And finally, of course, I asked it, how would I take these automated tests that I've recorded or these automated tests that I've got? How can I make them more resilient? Because again, one of the things that people bring up all the time is my test cases are way too fragile. Every time we do something, all my automation tests break. Okay, fine. Let's give those automation tests to an agent and let's see if it can figure out how to make things less fragile. And again, many of the recommendations actually look like the kinds of things that I would recommend as someone who's worked with the technology, but it works on your code. It works on your tests. Okay. Now, finally, one of the most interesting things that AI agents are able to do is to do what we call bug prediction. Now, we could do an entire webinar on bug prediction, right? But basically, it comes down to this. I give it some code. I give it a function. Like, for example, in one of our test automation classes, I have a C# function, and I say this function has some bugs in it. Build enough test cases to find the bugs. Well, I took that same code that we used in that exercise, and I took some other similar code and said, find the bugs. All right, it didn't find every possible bug. I didn't try too hard, but it did find the kinds of bugs that I usually ask the students to look for. Again, one of those things that is very valuable to try, or even just saying, hey, here's a function, build some unit tests for this. So generative AI has a tremendous value for not just, generating text and poems and songs and stories and pictures of cats and mice and so forth. But it can be really helpful as an adjunct to your software testing processes. Thing most people will start with, automating the boring, repetitive process of forming the test cases. But then we can use it to sort of provide a lot of more insights to kind of think out of the box when it comes to our overall testing problems, to come up with better test plan, and ultimately to get us into automated testing. If you haven't done it yet, maybe this can provide the mechanisms. Okay, I always wind up with this little cartoon. How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. How do you get to generative AI? Practice, practice, practice. I hope that today's presentation has kind of encouraged you to go out there and get your ChatGPT or your Claude or your Perplexity or some of each and start throwing some testing ideas at it. Say, build me some test cases. Evaluate this test plan. Find some bugs in this code. Right? All of those are the kinds of things that are great for starting off and getting you started in the world of software testing. Okay, I want to thank you, and we do have some time for some questions here, so go ahead and take any questions. Okay, what about testing proprietary content on public generative AI? What are our safeguards? Well, all right, I'm going to start by saying, number one, if you are concerned about that, one of my colleagues says, never upload something in a prompt that you wouldn't mind posting on Facebook to the world. All right. So now to that end, one of the suggestions that I've had, and one of the things that I have tried, is what are sometimes called proprietary GPTs or private GPTs. These can be various kinds of agents that run directly on your own computer. These would be things like GPT for All, LM Studio, and so forth. Now, they're not as fast, but you can try and you can see that nothing leaks out of your own organization. Now, the trick to using those is that with something like LM Studio or GPT for All, you can select from a whole lot of different language models, like various flavors of Llama and so forth. And, there's some testing that you want to do on your own to see which ones of those work well for you. Anything else?
This has been great, Mark. I'm getting a lot of good feedback, and I'm just been trying to respond to everyone. I'm getting emails and great just comments and praise for your presentation and for the content. We're just really learning a lot from you, so we appreciate you being here and sharing. And I did want to mention there are a couple questions in the Q&A. I don't know if you saw that, Mark, versus the chat. It looked like
Can you go ahead and read one of them to me?
Sure. Michael was asking about test case generation. What's your experience between last century style parentheses generate test after coding and this century style parentheses start with tests? I see a lot of folks using AI to generate tests after the fact. Have you had success with using tests to drive the development?
Yes, absolutely. That's the only way to do it. And when you realize that your test cases are your specification, all right, this is actually something which, I and some colleagues have been saying for years. If you look at something like test-driven development, it is not a new concept. The idea of saying, here are the examples that we want to use, and this is how this software should work. Way back in the 1970s, some of the Unix guys called this write the user manual first, right? And I'm always surprised when I hear people go, oh, that's a novel concept. Okay, it's been around for a long time. Okay, in fact, if you've ever heard the phrase that was popular a few years ago, shift left, well, all that was saying was, let's take some of those testing activities, like writing test cases, and let's move them earlier in the process. They shift left. So back to Michael's point, your real value is not writing test cases after the fact. Your real value is, hey, I'm going to write test cases when I'm thinking of the problem. And those test cases are going to actually help drive the requirements process. I see the analyst and the tester role as kind of being very, very close.
Great. Thank you for that answer.
Sure.
And thank you all for your warm feedback and your encouraging comments. We really appreciate that. Our goal is to really offer you a valuable use of your time. And so if you have questions that we didn't answer, we'd love to hear those too. You can always reach us on LinkedIn, or you can email me, Lara, Larah, at softdead.com. And I just want to say before we hang up, and I was trying to put it in the chat as we went along, we do have some really great opportunities to continue training on this topic. Marc's teaching the AI for software testing course at the end of May is the first time we're going to be running that course. So if you're interested in this topic and you would like a discount, I saw that question in the comments. I'm going to paste a code right now into the chat. And this code you can use for any of our AI courses. So whether it's AI for testing, whether it's AI for project management, AI for business analysis, you can use that for 20% off. And we offer that to our webinar attendees. So I'll be emailing this out to you guys afterwards. And I'll give you links to the courses so you can check them out. Feel free to let us know if you have any questions about them, if you are interested in group, whether that's private, group, courses, or if you have other questions about the content, we are happy to talk to you about any of that.
And speaking of which, all of this is all very new. In the AI for testing course, for example, is still under development. In fact, I would say it's going to be still under development for many years as we're rolling it out. So I'll give you the piece of homework that I give to everybody on day one of the class. If there are things that are really of interest to you that you'd like to learn about having to do with AI for testing or even AI for business analysis, and you don't see them in the outlines, let us know, because it's what's useful to you that really drives what we put into the classes.
Great. That's a great point. And same thing with the webinars. If you guys have topics you'd like us to present on, we're happy to take those into consideration, as we're always adding 2-3 webinars per month to our calendar. So I'm going to also just real quick pitch the AI Day conference that we have coming up, which is April 30th. It's a full day of generative AI training for project professionals. And I had mentioned the code earlier in the chat for a 25% discount. And that is for a full day of training. We have 10 plus speakers. I think we're up to 10 now. Plus, David and I will be facilitating the Q&A networking session afterwards. So please feel free to check that out, and you can use the code GenAI25 to get 25%. And if you do it in the next few days during the early bird, you get that extra discount too. So it's a really great value. You'll get 8 PDU codes for your certification of choice, and happy to answer any questions about that too. Feel free to reach out if you have questions.
Okay.
We have one comment. It would be nice to do a review and comparison of the free models available on Hugging Face, etc., specifically for QA. It's a good suggestion. Hands-on activities. Okay, yep. We're definitely doing a lot of hands-on things at the conference, and Marc's all about hands-on.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you do not come into one of our courses expecting to sit there, you are going to work. But you're going to have fun when you're working. You're going to learn a lot.
Well, I'll wrap it up. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for your time and attention. We will be in touch by email with the recording, with your PDU code, and with the links to some of the courses. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or feedback for us. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Marc, for presenting
Thank you.
This great content. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
All right.